There exists an imminent danger of nuclear weapons in East Asia. North Korea's nuclear and missile program is a direct threat. As I often say, Ukraine of today may be East Asia of tomorrow.
이제 한미 동맹은 핵을 기반으로 하는 동맹으로 고도화되었습니다. 한미 핵 협의 그룹을 통해 미국의 핵 자산과 우리의 비핵 자산을 결합한 일체적 대응 체계를 구축해 나갈 것입니다.
If the invasion of Ukraine has unleashed a huge arms race in Europe, in East Asia, the main obsession is to find a nuclear cover. In particular, South Korea and Japan have long been behind the US nuclear umbrella. There are plenty of reasons for this. For years, Tokyo and Seoul have been putting up with threats from North Korea and the launching of intercontinental missile tests that every now and then put the security systems of these two countries on alert. This is no joke. North Korea is an openly hostile country with 6 successful nuclear tests since 2006. In recent years, the Biden administration has greatly expanded its commitment to protecting its allies in this corner of the world. However, that has not stopped a growing number of voices in South Korea from clamoring for less reliance on Uncle Sam and wanting to have their own strategic deterrent. The numbers are quite clear.
Nearly 73% of South Koreans want country to develop nuclear weapons.
And in Japan, well, the story is a bit more complicated because of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the truth is that, in this case, the Japanese may not be so far away from having their own nuclear weapons.
Japan is happy to let neighbors like China and North Korea believe it is part of the nuclear club because it has a bomb in the basement, the material and the means to produce nuclear weapons within 6 months, according to some estimates.
Indeed, this is why many analysts consider Japan to be a de facto nuclear state. Now, do these two Asian powers really need to have their own nuclear arsenal? How close are they to being able to get it? How would this change the geopolitical chessboard in the region? Well, we're going to tell you all that and more in this video. Let's get started. The history of nuclear weapons in Korea and Japan is not exactly new. For example, since the 1950s, and until the US's return of Okinawa to the Japanese administration in 1972, the Americans had nuclear weapons stationed there. And in South Korea, it was even more obvious, because Seoul, unlike Tokyo, had no problem with the deployment of nuclear weapons in the country. Logically, they considered them to be the best possible deterrent for stopping North Korea. In fact, for 33 long years, between 1958 and 1991, Uncle Sam had nuclear weapons in South Korea, and not just a few. He accumulated up to 950 warheads in this country. One way or another, and despite never having finished developing them, nuclear weapons have always been a matter of life and death for Seoul. Nevertheless, with the end of the Cold War and the non-proliferation treaties agreed with Moscow, the United States began to redeploy and destroy many of these nuclear weapons. The Americans, however, pledged to continue to protect their allies with their nuclear umbrella. The idea was to do so with the weapons stationed in their own enclaves, such as the island of Guam. But what if this is no longer enough? The trust of South Koreans and Japanese in the United States was severely damaged during Donald Trump's presidency, a period in which the former president's attacks, criticisms, and lack of commitment to his major allies in Asia was a constant. We're referring to things like these, for instance.
Trump demands Japan and South Korea pay for nuclear umbrella. Trump administration weighs troop cut in South Korea. Trump wants to end horrible South Korea-US trade deal. Koreans disagree.
The dream of any enemy of Seoul and Tokyo. Politically, militarily, and commercially, Trump was all about punishing these countries. At the same time, as you will remember, he loved to goof around in meetings full of smiles and love letters with Kim Jong-un. Meetings that, by the way, ended up being totally futile. They served absolutely no purpose. Evidently, all of these things fueled a growing debate in both Japan and South Korea about whether perhaps relying too much on the United States was a mistake. And of course, now that Trump is running for re-election as president, this debate has flared up again. Among other reasons, because the former president ignores Seoul and Tokyo when it comes to making decisions and drawing up plans such as this one.
Donald Trump is considering a plan to let North Korea keep its nuclear weapons and offer its regime financial incentives to stop making new bombs, according to 3 people briefed on his thinking.
Denuclearization? Bah, what's the point? You keep your bombs, and what's more, I'll send you a few checks. The perfect message for other satraps around the world to embark on the same adventure. At this rate, we'll see Washington financing North Korea, Iran, and any other warlord who wants to get his own apocalyptic confetti packet. As you can imagine, news like this goes completely against the grain of what South Korea and Japan are looking for. And of course, that has consequences. Consequences like this.
South Korean calls to acquire nuclear weapons, which were subdued for the past year following steps to strengthen the U.S.-South Korea alliance, are once again bubbling to the surface ahead of the possible return of former U.S. President Donald Trump.
Not so strange, right? But back to the initial question. Could these two countries acquire their own nuclear weapons? Even if it means violating the non-proliferation treaty they themselves signed, the answer is yes. Both South Korea and Japan are ready to build nuclear bombs within a few months. This is something they have been stealthily preparing for over the years. For example, Korea had a nuclear program developed during the dictatorship of Park Chung-hee that in 1972, after 3 active years, was cancelled. However, the knowledge acquired during that time is still preserved. Let's just say that the research never fell into oblivion. And in Japan, well, it was a very similar story. Over the years, they have tried to have a fairly precise knowledge of how to develop nuclear devices at full speed, although in this case, as we shall see, there are added difficulties. In any case, if this is so, if both countries are so close, why haven't they started to manufacture bombs as, for instance, Israel has done? Well, let's take a look.
He who can and will not.
Japan is a country where the nuclear issue is practically a social taboo, and no wonder. It's the only country that has suffered not 1, but 2 nuclear attacks. That is something that has given them a real fear of these weapons. Do you want to know a curious story about this? Well, check it out. In July 2023, the Oppenheimer movie was released, which, as most of you probably know, is about the Manhattan Project. But what if I told you that in Japan, it didn't hit theaters until March 2024, almost a year later? Yes, that's right. And the question is, why? Well, take a look.
Cinemagoers in Japan will soon be able to see box office hit Oppenheimer. The blockbuster's release was postponed amid controversy over an unofficial marketing campaign that critics said trivialized the 1945 nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
If this is happening because of a movie about the American nuclear program, imagine what would happen if someone were to openly say that Japan has to get into the nuclear war race. Something that, on the other hand, many of you may find contradictory. After all, Japan is one of the most nuclear countries in the world. It owes much of its economic development to the energy of atoms, and it is the country that does the most research into civil nuclear applications. However, unlike South Korea, when it comes to weapons, things change radically. For example, 2019, a survey analyzed Japanese opinion on the recent treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We're talking about a treaty launched in 2017 that ultimately seeks to eliminate nuclear weapons. Well, check out the results. 3/4 of the Japanese population supports the elimination of nuclear weapons. We're talking about an idea deeply rooted among Japanese people of all ages, sexes, and income levels. But be careful, because that's not all. A 2017 survey revealed that 8 out of 10 Japanese would not even agree with the US using nuclear weapons against North Korea, even in the event of Pyongyang attacking Japan. In other words, they would not want to use nuclear weapons even in self-defense. Although, we would have to see what could happen when the time comes. If you have dealt with Japanese people, you will know that one thing is what they tell you they think, and another thing is what they actually end up doing. Whatever the case, the point is that in this whole matter, any Japanese politician has to declare himself adverse to his country's nuclear rearmament, regardless of whether he actually thinks it might be a good thing for national security. It's simply something that cannot be said. Well, maybe except for this guy.
Japan's ex-leader Shinzo Abe says the country should think about getting nukes.
After stepping down as the head of government in 2020, the late Shinzo Abe became a figurehead for Japanese rearmament. Abe moved to introduce a more pragmatic view of nuclear deterrence in the public debate, especially in light of the invasion against Ukraine in 2022. Nor should we forget that, apart from North Korea, Russia is also a country bordering Japan. Not only that, Moscow has a territorial dispute with Tokyo over the Kuril Islands. However, Abe's assassination in July 2022 removed such ideas from the political agenda outright. That said, the question that I'm sure many of you are wondering is, so what about the possibility of Japan developing its own nuclear deterrent? Well, if we listen to the current Prime Minister, who, moreover, was Abe's minister and from the same party, the truth is that the idea seems to have gone to the grave with the former Prime Minister.
I have worked to revitalize the non-proliferation treaty regime so that we can gain momentum in pursuit of the aspiration.
You see, Kishida's family is from Hiroshima, and he has been a legislator for the first electoral district of Hiroshima for no less than 7 terms. And of course, given such a track record, it's no wonder that Kishida has often said that he considers the fight against nuclear proliferation to be his life's work. And not only that, in 1971, Japan's own parliament adopted the so-called 3 anti-nuclear principles, a state policy that prohibits possessing, producing, and allowing the introduction of nuclear weapons from third countries into Japan. So in order to complete the nuclear weapons program, they would first have to abolish these principles. And what can I say? The way Japanese politics and society are configured, this seems very complicated, if not impossible. However, it's one thing to know what you can or want to do, and quite another to know whether it would really be in Japan's interest to have nuclear weapons. That's the big question. And the answer is probably yes. The development of nuclear weapons by Japan, and also South Korea, would rebalance the military deterrence capability in the region. We're talking about East Asia, an area where all the nuclear powers are dictatorships that attack freedoms, and in some cases play outside international rules. Naturally, we're talking about China and North Korea, 2 countries that are already nuclear powers. And at this point, the question that many of us should ask ourselves is, wouldn't it be reasonable for 2 of the only liberal democracies in the area to have at least that much capacity? In Japan, despite having the capability, you can see that it's not popular at all. However, the situation in South Korea is completely different. So, could this country become the first democratic nuclear nation in East Asia in the near future? Well, pay attention because it could be closer than we think. Check it out.
Nukes yes, nukes no.
South Korea's and Japan's views on nuclear weapons, as we have told you, have been and are very different. In fact, if we were to bet on which of the 2 countries might have nuclear weapons of their own soonest, betting on Japan would almost be like betting on your grandmother winning the New York Marathon, running in ballet shoes. Now, why do we say that North Korea might not be far away from becoming a nuclear power? Well, you see, as we've told you before, since the early 1990s, the United States no longer has nuclear warheads deployed in South Korea. And now the debate about a nuclear program of its own is growing like wildfire, especially after Trump's presidency. As we saw earlier, 7 out of 10 South Koreans are in favor of the country having atomic weapons. But why are more and more people supporting this idea? Okay, I'm sure your quickest answer will be North Korea, right? Well, no, I'm sorry, look at this. Only 23% of South Koreans want their country to develop nuclear weapons in order to counter threats from North Korea. What's more, the most popular response, at nearly 40%, is to defend against threats from others that have nothing to do with North Korea. Any idea who we might be talking about? Exactly.
China's military expansion and aggressive posturing and North Korea's nuclear expansion are changing allied threat perceptions, especially in Asia. These come on the heels of the Trump administration's extortionate approach to alliances, which seriously damaged U.S. credibility.
China, despite being Seoul's largest trading partner, is also the biggest security challenge regionally, ahead of even North Korea. Seoul has long been concerned about Beijing's military expansion, its increasingly belligerent rhetoric, its verbal aggressiveness, and constant provocations against Taiwan. In fact, China also lashes out at South Korea from time to time. For example, in December 2023, Russian and Chinese bombers and fighters jointly and illegally entered the airspace of South Korea and Japan, even circling the South Korean islands of Ulleungdo and Dokdo. So much so that the South Korean and Japanese air forces had to deploy interceptor fighters. That was not the only time China has engaged in military provocation of South Korea. Infiltrations into South Korea's air defense identification zone by China have been going on for years. What was different last December was that they did it alongside Russia and in the midst of the war in Ukraine. What message are these 2 dictatorial regimes trying to send us? Who knows? But certainly these things help explain the sudden affection the South Koreans seem to have for nuclear weapons. Not only that, but for many South Koreans, having atomic weapons is not only a matter of national security, but also a matter of national pride and identity. You know, they think that with the atomic weapon, no one will dare to fight them again. Well, obviously, this enormous social support means that, unlike in Japan, more and more politicians are advocating this possibility, including the current South Korean president Yoon Suk-yeol.
더 문제가 심각해져가지고 여기 뭐 대한민국에 무슨 전술핵 배치를 한다든지 우리 자신이 그 자체 핵을 보유할 수도 있습니다.
Now, if South Korea is under the US nuclear umbrella, why do they want to have their own radioactive mushrooms? Well, because when it comes down to it, the South Koreans are not sure that the Americans would dare to use their atomic bombs to defend them. 5 out of 10 South Koreans believe that the White House would think twice about helping Seoul. This is in a scenario of active conflict with North Korea. If the conflict were with another power, such as China, although that is much less likely, surely even fewer people would believe the US would help. In fact, only 36% of South Koreans believe that Washington would come to their assistance without hesitation in the event of a rocket fight with Pyongyang. And remember, this is happening in a country that had already been helped by the United States in the Korean War, and that basically owes Uncle Sam for its very existence. These are really bad confidence figures. Now, not all of the blame for this distrust comes from Trump's terrible attitude towards Seoul and other allies during his presidency. An important part of this distrust also comes from the limitations that the United States has historically imposed on South Korea's development of local weapons. You see, for years, South Korea has had to follow the so-called ballistic missile range guidelines agreed to in 1979, whereby the United States has been limiting Seoul's ability to develop certain types of weapons. Why? Well, until the early 1990s, South Korea was a military dictatorship, and trust between the two governments, however allied they were, was surely not what it is today. Nevertheless, with changes over time, it was not until May 2021 that South Korea was completely freed from these restrictions on the development of missiles of their choice.
U.S. lifts missile restrictions on South Korea, ending range and warhead limits.
Why has it taken so long? Is it because of a lack of mutual distrust? Is it because they are subjected to the United States? Well, only the United States really knows. The fact is that South Korea is now at a crossroads. It's a country where the majority of the population wants to have nuclear weapons. Current government also looks favorably on developing its own nuclear weapons, but the problem is that it cannot do so. Why? Well, here comes the big issue in this whole story, and it explains why neither Seoul nor Tokyo may ever have their own atomic weapons. Listen up.
The harakiri?
Yes, politically, strategically, and militarily, it may make all the sense in the world for these two liberal democracies, the only ones in East Asia besides Taiwan, to have their atomic bombs. However, have you stopped to think about the price it would cost them? I'll tell you right now, it would be so high that perhaps the cost benefit leans more towards continuing to rely on the American nuclear umbrella indefinitely. You see, if either of these two countries were to embark on this adventure, the first thing that would surely happen would be an enormous erosion of their international image, starting with the fact that they would have to abandon the non-proliferation treaty they have signed. So not a great start. That would be tremendously unpopular at the international level. Then they would probably get up to their necks in an intense political and economic confrontation with China. For example, don't forget the brutal economic boycott launched by the Chinese government against Seoul when the US THAAD missile shield was installed in South Korea. Suddenly, the country ran dry of Chinese tourists. South Korean brands virtually stopped doing business in China, and the economic damage was enormous. Can you imagine what would happen in the event of launching a nuclear program? China is the largest trading partner for South Korean exports, and the second largest for Japanese exports, close behind the United States, so the damage could be enormous. And not only that, China and Russia could also legitimize even more the North Korean nuclear program, closing any possible door to support resolutions at the UN against it. They could even ignore international sanctions and openly assist the communist regime in Pyongyang, both militarily and economically. So the economic, political, and even security costs would become so high that, for now, it seems that neither Seoul nor Tokyo will develop their own nuclear weapons, and that perhaps the South Korean pressures are aimed only at obtaining greater commitments from Washington. Now, what do you think? Do you think South Korea could really end up developing the atomic bomb? Do you think Japan would change its mind about it if China continues to become more and more dangerous? And could the two countries end up agreeing to allow the US to deploy nuclear weapons of its own on its territory? Well, leave us your opinions below in the comments and let's start a debate. And very important, if you liked this video, hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. As always, thank you for being there. All the best. See you next time.